This is the new 2024 Lotus Eletre, and it's probably the most surprising new car on sale. Lotus, a brand that's known for its formula of creating simple, basic, lightweight sports cars, a brand that's known for its Britishness, a brand that's known for its old-school analog performance vehicles, is now offering a 6,000-pound electric SUV that's built in China. What? How? Today, I'm going to explain it all, and I'll show you all of the Eletre's quirks and features, including probably its biggest quirk, the Eletre itself. Today's video is brought to you by Cars and Bids, my online enthusiast car auction site that recently sold this, and this, and this, and this, and this. All right, time for the quirks and features of the new Lotus electric SUV, and we start with its name, which is pronounced Eletre. That's how it's said, Eletre, in case you're curious. This follows a tradition of other Lotus models that have their names start with E, like the Elise, the Evora, the Spree, etc., etc. All down the Lotus line, the Eletre is next. And since we've covered that quirk, time to move on to the rest, and we'll start on the outside with these triangles mounted below the front bumper. You can see a bunch of different triangles here, and they're all sort of closed up plastic panels. Well, when you turn on the Eletre, the triangles all start to open up to allow for air to pass through for battery cooling. And apparently, these triangles will open and close depending on how much cooling the battery needs at any given moment, which is kind of a cool look if you notice it. Now, speaking of interesting exterior openings, here's one in the front area. You can see this opens all the way through the car. There's actually an air channel passing through here, and you have that same one over on the other side symmetrical. Same deal in the back. You have an air channel here that also passes all the way through the car, so air flows through here, which is certainly unusual in an SUV, but it's also a Lotus, and so aerodynamics for high performance makes some sense. And since we're talking about the rear, here's an interesting one. The rear light bar spans the entire way across the car. As you can see, just one thin, long light bar, and when you put on the turn signal, it sort of gradually changes from light bar to turn signal, which is kind of a cool look. I actually like how that's done. There's not a specific spot where the turn signal starts, it just sort of fades into turn signal. Up front, you also have a cool turn signal look. It lights up gradually, you can see, shooting out from the middle of the car, although I'm not sure if that turn signal design will be allowed on US market versions of the Eletre. This is a European model, and so it has some European specific changes, and that turn signal, I'm not sure if it complies with regulations, so it may not make it, but it is pretty cool. Now, going back to the rear of the Eletre, one other interesting item back here, the rear wing, which is certainly absolutely bizarre in its shape and placement. It doesn't go all the way over the tailgate, certainly an unusual rear wing design. And also unusual is this panel right in the middle of the rear wing, which just kind of sticks out there. That is not the third brake light. Instead, that contains LiDAR equipment. So cameras, sensors, radar, all sorts of equipment in that panel, and it's not the only one in this car. You also have this panel here located on the top, sort of right in the middle, and this panel located above the wheel arch on the outside of the car. These panels also contain LiDAR equipment. Now, Lotus tells me they do this for future-proofing the cars. When in the future, a more advanced self-driving system is capable of being installed in the Eletre, the hardware will already be here inside these various panels and placements on the outside of the car, and hopefully at that point it will just be a software update to make the car more self-driving capable. Right now, that software is still in development, and so these cameras just sort of remain in their place until they can be used. used. Now, especially interesting, inside the infotainment screen, there's actually a setting where you can open up all of the LiDAR panels and see the cameras and sensors. They pop out and reveal themselves, and you can take a look at your LiDAR equipment if you want to, although of course the default setting is all of these panels are closed since there's no software that makes use of them yet. But anyway, next we move inside the Eletre, where we have many more interesting quirks. We start with the giant screen, which, as you can see, is, well, giant, and it's pretty good. It's very quick to respond, very high quality, high resolution. You tap it, it does exactly what you'd expect. It's fairly intuitive, high quality cameras. You can make all the changes and adjustments you want, and everything is pretty easy to figure out with this big screen. Now, interestingly, the default main screen is an image of the car, and the image of the car precisely mirrors what's actually happening with the car. So for example, you put on the turn signal and the turn signal turns on the car shown in the image. You put on the high beams and the high beams turn on in the image. Same deal with the brake lights. It all exactly mirrors on the screen what's actually happening in the real world, which is certainly a bit unusual. Now, one cool thing about this car default screen is you can use it to operate various items throughout the car. Probably the quirkiest is the giant sunroof, which you can see right now is a big piece of glass. You look out and see the sky and the world. Well, go onto this car screen, tap on the sunroof, and you can adjust exactly how much light gets through this giant piece of glass, including none at all. You can change in an instant whether you can see through it or whether it's totally clear. There's no big sunshade that rolls across. Instead, there's some sort of sorcery within the glass that can make it completely transparent or block it completely at precisely whichever moment you want and to precisely whichever degree you want. But it's not just the sunroof's transparency that can be operated from this main car home screen. There's a lot of other stuff you can do here too. You can open up the charge port door, for example, with a quick tap on the screen. You can open up the tailgate to get into the cargo area. And my personal favorite, you can raise or lower the rear spoiler in one of several different positions. There's a 0, position 1, position 2. You can choose exactly what you want on this screen. Now, beyond the giant center screen inside this interior, you have two other screens here as well. One is over on the passenger side, and you can see the default is just showing the time and date and day of the week, which is nice. But when you have music turned on, this passenger side screen can also be used to change the track and adjust the music that you're listening to, which is a nice touch. Now, over on the driver's side, you have the exact same screen size mirrored over here, but obviously it's completely different. This one isn't a touchscreen, and instead it shows your vehicle basics. The speed you're traveling, the odometer, it has your percent charge remaining, your range left, your warning lights, the gear you're in. All the normal stuff you would typically see in a gauge cluster is on that thin little screen strip on the driver's side of the dashboard. But beyond these screens inside this car, there's a lot of other interesting quirks in here. Let's start in the center console, where you can see these two circles, which are of course cup holders. Now, the way they operate is kind of interesting. Right now they're up. They don't really hold any cups, but you can push them down and then you have a cup holder. And if you want them to come back up, you press a button and they rise automatically, which I guess you could use to present your drink to you if it's inside the cup holder, which is kind of a funny idea. The actual reason they're designed like this is so you can have them all the way up if you just want your center console to be mostly flat and you don't want to look at your cup holders for whatever reason. Now, next to the cup holders, you have this switch here. This is your gear selector. You can see park is a button over to the left marked P, down for drive, neutral's in the middle, and you get reverse if you push up, and then the little light at the top of the gear switch turns red, I guess as an extra indication that you're in reverse. This is how you switch gears in the Eletre. Now, next up, we move to the set of controls directly next to the gear selector, and these are certainly interesting. The giant switches on the left and right sides, these control your climate temperature. Left, obviously, for the driver, and right for the passenger. They had one cool touch with those switches, by the way. When you move them up to turn up the temperature, the little light on top of the switch briefly turns red, and so does the little light in the climate vent. You can see up is red, and of course, you go down for cold, and it briefly turns blue, which is a cool little hidden Easter egg that adds to the fun. On this little control panel, you also have defrosters for front and rear, plus an auto setting for the climate control. Now, unfortunately, these are your only climate controls that have physical buttons. The rest of the climate controls are all integrated into the screen, and the integration isn't exactly great. You have to tap here and go into a menu, and then you can make further taps, and you got to do this even to turn on simple stuff like your heated seats or your heated steering wheel. Now, a lot of cars that have climate controls in the screen have a bar across the lower end of the screen that have all that stuff kind of just always sitting there for you to adjust it. Not here. You do have to go into a menu, which is a shame. And you even have to go into a menu, here's a crazy one, to adjust the center climate vent, the airflow direction for this center vent. If you want it to blow higher, lower, whatever, it's not just a switch on the vent itself. Instead, it's controlled through the screen, which certainly adds some complication just to change where the air is blowing. Now, moving away from the climate controls and back to the center control panel here, you can see also a lock and unlock button, pretty self-explanatory, and this one, which has two lines and then an arrow, that opens up the glove box. You push that and then the glove box automatically opens up on the passenger side. You do not have a traditional glove box latch in this car. Speaking of not traditional in this car, let's move on to the steering wheel, which at first glance looks fairly standard, like a fairly normal steering wheel, including it has paddles, which you would expect a performance car to have, but these are not your typical paddles. Instead, they are switches, and they're independent on each side. So on the left side, what looks like the left shift paddle is actually up and down, and it controls your regen. Exactly how much regen you want, more or less, you can control it with this switch that looks like a paddle. Over on the right side, the paddle is once again an up and down switch that controls, this time, your drive mode. You can cycle through the different drive modes by going up and down, and they'll appear both on the center screen and on your driver gauge cluster screen to let you know which drive mode you're in. Now, one interesting thing worth pointing out, if you go into range mode to maximize your driving range, that puts the car in front wheel drive only. It obviously also limits power. It closes up those triangles in front to maximize aero, but it also goes into front wheel drive only to maximize range, which is an interesting measure to take to get the most miles possible out of your Eletre. Now, beyond the shift paddle switches, the rest of the steering wheel controls are also unusual. You can see over on the right side, this rocker controls your volume, or also there's an inner rocker that you can use to turn on your voice control, or also select this configurable button that you can switch to whatever you want it to do. Same deal over on the other side. This adjusts your cruise control, but the unorthodox button placement persists. If you press this left button, it turns on cruise control, and then up or down adjusts the speed you're going, and then the rocker in the middle adjusts your following distance to the car in front of you. Very unusual steering wheel controls, although you get used to them. They work pretty well, and they're kind of fun. Now, moving on to some more unusual controls, we go to the door panel where you have this button here. You press that and it pops open the door automatically. These doors have an electronic release, so you push, it electronically pops, and then you push it the rest of the way. Just in case the electronic popper breaks, there is a manual release located right here where you can mechanically open up the door as a backup. More interesting in this area of controls on the driver's door panel, though, is the control for the power mirrors. You can see there's a button here that shows the mirror moving, but you don't have your usual toggle switch to select which mirror or your pad to move the mirror. That's because you press this button and then the mirror control actually pops up in the driver's gauge cluster and tells you to use the switch on the steering wheel that's normally for stereo volume. You can move the mirror that way, up, down, left, right, and you can select which mirror you're controlling. It makes sense, but it's certainly an unorthodox mirror control compared to basically anything else you're probably used to. And next up, we move on to the interior lights in this car, which are interesting. Let's start with the reading lights, which are located on the ceiling here, where they are in most cars. You tap on it and they light up individually and gradually, just like the front turn signals, which frankly is a pretty cool trick, and I like how that operates. More noticeable, though, is the light bar going across the entire dashboard. You can see from driver side to passenger side, and it's included with all these little trim lines that that are oriented to the very center of the interior, depending on exactly where you're looking. That's a pretty cool touch, and more excitingly, you can change the color if you want. You go into the infotainment system, into settings, tap on lights, and then you can adjust the color of this and the rest of the interior ambient lights to be whatever you want, which kind of adds to the cool factor in here. And finally, before I climb in back, I want to talk about the general interior in this car, which is frankly pretty good. You got a lot of high quality materials. Everything looks nice in here, feels modern and cool. This big screen that works well. You got a lot of good stuff in this interior, as you would expect considering the price tag of this car. I'll get into the exact pricing later, but generally speaking, it is nice in here, feels very rewarding and high quality up front. And next we move on to the back seat in the Eletre, which is shockingly large. That's something I never thought I would say about the back seat in a Lotus, but that is the situation here. There is a lot of space in this back seat. The electric car architecture always allows for a little more interior room than a gas car because you don't have an engine up front, so you can generally pull the interior out a bit more, and they've taken advantage of that here. This has more space than gas-powered SUVs that are this size. It is a surprisingly spacious back seat area where you got a lot of room for people on both sides and in the middle. And speaking of the middle, our next interesting quirk is this screen for rear passengers. You can see a touch screen here, just like what you have up front, but a lot smaller, and well, frankly, it can do a lot less stuff. You can adjust your sound back here, specifically your sound preference, exactly how you want the sound to come out of the speakers. You have that adjustment in the back, as you can see. You also have seat adjustments back here, although they're fairly limited. For the rear seats, you can only adjust the backrest, but you can move the front passenger seat forward if you want to, in order to get a little bit more legroom if you're sitting directly behind that seat in the rear. Now, you also have physical controls for the rear seat backrest located on the side of the seat if you would rather use them instead of the screen. And another nice function of this screen, you can adjust the transparency of the sunroof glass just like you could up front. You also have that control in back. Other than that, not too much going on in this rear screen. When the climate control's on, you can change your climate temperature back here, which is nice, and you can also turn off the screen entirely by pressing this little moon, and then it's gone. You don't have the light coming in from the screen. And if you want to turn it back on, you just tap it anywhere and it comes back on. Now, a couple of other interesting things worth noting back here. For one, there are several different climate vents in back. You can see this one directly in the center above the screen even has its own ambient light, just like the front people have on the dashboard. You also have these individual climate vents for each side rear passenger, which is a nice feature to have. Now, to add to your comfort, you also have this center armrest, which comes down and you can, well, put your arms on it. But it also doubles as a cup holder. You can open up a cup holder from here to store your drinks, and there's even a little storage compartment. You can open that up and then, well, store stuff if that's what you want to do. Next up, another interesting quirk back here. The rear door panels oddly have window controls for both sides. So regardless of which side you're sitting on, you can roll down or up the windows on your side and the other side, which sounds like it'll lead to some battles among children sitting in the back, but that's what they've done. You also have your electronic door popper here, as you can see, and once again, there is a manual backup door popper lower down in the panel in case you need to get out mechanically. One thing you don't have back here, though, is charge ports for devices. I've looked everywhere, all throughout the rear of this car, under the seats, the back of the center console, and I don't see any device charge ports, which is a shame because, well, that's really important for rear seat passengers. I was recently in a car that had 4 in the back. This has 0. Kind of an unfortunate miss, although not that surprising from a company that's never made a car with, well, real back seats before. And next up, we move on to the cargo area in the Eletre. You open it up. It has an automatic tailgate just like everything else. Pop it open and you discover the cargo area is actually surprisingly large in this vehicle. You got decent space in terms of width and depth of this cargo area. Again, a bit of a surprise in terms of interior volume, bigger than I expected, just like the back seat. Although you do lose some vertical height because of the sloping rear end design of this car. So if you want to put something absolutely massive back here, you might run into trouble, but generally speaking, it is a surprisingly large cargo area, and there's extra cargo space under the floor. You lift up this latch, you can see some more storage under here in case you have some smaller item that's fragile that you don't want rolling around. Also worth pointing out back here, this button on the side will lower the car. The Eletre has air suspension, and if you have some heavy item you can't quite lift it into the back, you can lower right here to make it easier to get stuff into the cargo area. And if storage is what you're after, there's more of it up front. This front hood panel pops open in the typical way with a little latch in the driver's footwell, and then from here you can come around, open it up, and you see there's an extra cargo compartment in here. Open up this plastic cover and there's extra space where you can store even more items if you can't fit it inside the car or in the cargo area. Lotus says obviously a great spot to put your charging cables and accessories if you want, but there's more space beyond that if you want to stick other charging equipment in here. Now, the other thing that I find interesting and worth pointing out up front here, there's a little badge that has the Lotus logo and it says Pioneers since 1948. In fact, the Lotus badging on this car is quite noticeable, starting with the main Lotus logo, which is now black, no longer yellow like in the past. It's black, it's sleeker, it's more modern, and there are a lot of other Lotus emblems hidden in unusual places throughout this car. For instance, open up the door, you can see it on the side of the dashboard, a Lotus logo right here. You also have this one, again referencing 1948, that's on the B pillar, covered up by the doors when they're closed, but when they're open, it's there if you have really good attention to detail and if you happen to notice it. You also have Lotus logos on the backs of the front seats, so rear seat passengers can sit there and ponder the Lotus emblem, and you even have a Lotus logo here on this handle that you lift up in the cargo area to get to the lower cargo floor. They've packed the car full of Lotus logos, some of which are in rather unorthodox places. So, the Eletre is basically bursting with Lotus pride, with its Lotus logos practically anywhere they could put them, all over the car. But is it really a Lotus? Well, it's certainly a lot different from basically anything Lotus has given us before. When you think about what previous Lotus models have represented, well, there's the famous Lotus ethos that they should simplify and add lightness to make a lightweight, simple car. That's not this. There is the Britishness of Lotus, the famed British sports car brand. That's not this. And then there's the creation of an analog, simple, back-to-basic sports car, free of all the modern technology and doodads. That's not really this either. Let's break it down, starting with its size. The Eletre is about 200 inches in length, a little over, which makes it roughly the same size as the new Land Rover Defender 110, the normal four-door version. That is certainly a large vehicle, and it's even larger when you factor in curb weight. This weighs about 5,600 pounds before you start putting people inside. That certainly doesn't come from the simplify and add lightness of previous Lotus models. Now, as for the Britishness, like I mentioned before, this is built in China. Lotus's parent company is now Chinese, and so as British as they might seem, well, they're not really anymore, and this isn't even manufactured there. And then there's the analog sports carness. Obviously, this is fully electric. You don't have a manual transmission or a lightweight, screen-free driving experience that focuses on the basics. None of that stuff is in this car. But this also isn't that surprising, considering we're living in the days where practically every high-end enthusiast car brand is making an SUV. Aston Martin has an SUV, Ferrari SUV, Porsche SUV, Bentley SUV, Lamborghini SUV. It was only a matter of time before Lotus came out with one, particularly if they want to grow sales, get new buyers, and make the company more successful. And in the realm of high-performance, high-end brand SUVs, this is a pretty impressive one, so let's talk numbers. The Eletre will be offered in two versions. There's the base model, which has 600 horsepower, or you can step up to the R, the high performance one, that's this. It has 900 horsepower. Now, the base level version does 0 to 60 in about 4.7 seconds, which is pretty quick, and it has about 315 miles of fully electric range. But the 900 horsepower R does 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds, which is truly impressive, on its way to about 260 miles of range. As for pricing, Lotus says the standard Eletre will start around $107,000, whereas this R model will be around $145,000 to start. Quite expensive, but you get a lot, especially in terms of performance. Seating, this is 2-row only, 5 total seats inside. There's no third row offered. And every Eletre will come standard with all-wheel drive. There's no 2-wheel drive version, unless of course you're in range mode, and then it's front wheel only. But all those numbers sound pretty appealing, and so now it's time to see what the Eletre can do and get out on the road behind the wheel of the newest and certainly most different Lotus model. All right, driving the Eletre, Eletre. No, it's called the Eletre, and I'm driving it. And the first thing I realized right away, getting behind the wheel and driving it, this is intended to be a performance SUV. Now that should be obvious because it's manufactured by Lotus and it has 900 horsepower, but it's also an electric car. It weighs 5,800 pounds, and a lot of thought has been given to technology and equipment and features rather than, you're wondering, does it still have that Lotus performance DNA? And the answer is yes, it absolutely still does. This still feels every bit like a high performance vehicle. And I mentioned that there's a few ways that you can instantly tell. Number one, the ride quality is pretty harsh, and that is due to a pretty surprisingly adept steering and handling capability that this car has. Teslas have great steering. You steer and quickly they change direction and they do what you want them to do, but they don't have the best handling in the sense that the ride is pretty floaty and they're not intended to go hard around corners. This car, it feels very differently. It's surprisingly flat, especially considering how heavy it is. And when you're going hard around corners, it actually stays put and stays flat and stays moving exactly how you want it to be. Quite predictable, quite sports car-like. Certainly among the better handling SUVs I've been in. Now, the drawback to this is you have a rather harsh ride quality. The suspension is pretty stiff. Even I'm in tour mode, the suspension is pretty stiff. And so it gives you a pretty stiff ride. That's the benefit. That's the other side of the excellent handling. Now, as far as acceleration, again, I'm in tour mode. I floor it. Yeah, I mean, it goes, to put it mildly. Here we go. Wow. Wow. That is quite impressive. And by the way, I'm going a speed already when I'm flooring it that is fast. And then to floor it and still feel that much more power and that much more acceleration is quite impressive. This is fast. They say 2.9 seconds 0 to 60. To me, frankly, it feels a little bit quicker than that. But either way, it moves. It absolutely moves. So you get good steering, good handling, and excellent acceleration. Now, of course, the big complaint about this vehicle is, and will continue to be, is it really a Lotus? I don't know. I mean, I'll let the commenters have that debate. I'll let the people who want to buy the car or not buy the car have that debate. It doesn't really fit in with the rest of the Lotus parameters, but then again, everybody else is doing electric SUVs and SUVs in general right now. Is the Puro Sangue really a Ferrari? If you don't factor in the badge though, if you don't even think about it and just think about the driving experience, purely the drive, it's pretty impressive actually. It's fast, it's fun, it's pretty quick, it's exciting, it handles reasonably well, and you have good tech. And frankly, I think it looks pretty good too. But this is a pretty impressive all-rounder if what you're looking for is just, real optimal performance from an SUV. You know, Porsche hasn't yet gone down the electric track with the Cayenne. BMW has with the iX, but the performance isn't really that impressive. That car's more about, you know, the style, the look, the interior quality, that sort of thing. There's going to be always a contingent of a lot of people who say that this isn't a Lotus, that it's, you know, the Chinese influence on Lotus has totally changed the direction of the brand. And I get that, and it's probably true. But from a purely like, what is this car perspective, it's pretty good if what you're looking for is all-out performance. It's very fast, it handles quite well, but you get a stiff ride and you pay a lot of money for it. And so you have to really be interested in prioritizing performance in order to want this vehicle, because you're paying for it and you're feeling it when you drive it around. But the benefit is you can go toe-to-toe with basically anything on the road and come out ahead, and you have quite an impressive and quite a competent SUV. And I will also say, you know, all these other brands have gone for SUVs, and I have generally been fairly disappointed with how they've turned out, to be perfectly frank. The Urus, I really don't think is good looking, and it's just basically Audi hardware and Audi underneath. It's just not as special as a Lamborghini. The Maserati Levante was poorly executed, just not that good of a vehicle. The Cayenne is great, but you know, we're not into electric versions of that yet. Same deal with the Cullinan, same deal with the Bentayga. This seems to be a pretty competitive and pretty impressive first effort at a luxury SUV from Lotus, in that it actually does seem competitive. It does sort of move the game forward since it's electric, and it really has excellent performance. And I'm surprisingly impressed with it. If you factor out, I'm looking at a Lotus badge and driving a 6,000-pound electric SUV. And so that's the new Lotus Eletre. This certainly isn't your typical Lotus, but it's a surprisingly compelling electric performance SUV. It has a lot of interesting quirks and a high price tag, and we'll see if Lotus dealership support. It's clear we're in a totally new age of Lotus, of cars, when Lotus makes an electric SUV. And now it's time to give the Eletre a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 68 out of 100, which places the Eletre R here against rivals. There's a lot to like about the Eletre R. Specifically, it looks great, it's supremely fast, and technology is impressive. The drawbacks are a high price tag, no third-row seating, and the Lotus brand name, which is usually a benefit, but instead makes for a controversial addition to the electric SUV scene. Overall, I liked the Eletre a lot more than I expected, as long as you ignore everything you've ever known about what Lotus stands for.